front of you having to explain why my shirt wasn't ironed, because on the trip on the way down, someone had spilt coffee on my original shirt. I had to buy a new one, and I felt I needed to explain we don't all come down from Manchester to London to talk to you about social mobility and not even bother to iron our shirts. Well, I have another shirt story today because I feel slightly inappropriately dressed because, of course, it's hot in Manchester, but in London, you've always got to go one better, and it's a bit hotter. So I would have probably dressed a little less conventionally to make today, but if you get on the train at Piccadilly Station early in the morning, GMP are giving out this warning. So they advised me that white men of my age bracket boarding the Avanti West Coast mainline service should avoid wearing a t-shirt jacket combo because it's likely to cause a hysterical reaction at Euston Station. In extreme cases, apparently, you could be carried head high through the streets of London all the way to Parliament to be sworn in as an MP. And in very extreme cases, you could end up being Prime Minister by tea time. So I decided I better just wear the conventional shirt today. So, and it's a huge pleasure to welcome you all to this symposium, to welcome all our panelists and our special speakers and special guests today. And our focus is on young people who are NEET, particularly those who are using the welfare system. It's an issue that's being widely discussed and debated at the moment, not least because of the interim diagnostic report on young people and work published by the Milburn Review. But it has not, until now, had sufficient attention from social mobility policymakers and campaigners. Social mobility debates have been focused far too much, we say, on long upward mobility from the bottom to the top. And at the Commission, we are not convinced that this is our biggest social mobility challenge. But it has tended to preoccupy the social mobility world, which has focused very much on young people with high educational attainment and their pathways into elite occupations. I think we're going to have a debate in this country, if we aren't already starting to have it, about the economic model which this version of social mobility feeds. Because it's one in which London and its concentration of financial and professional services has increasingly become the main breadwinner for the country. But outside London and the South East, every region pays less in tax than it receives in grants, subsidies and welfare. And we've lived with this model for around 30 to 40 years, and in that time, it's true to say that London has been a remarkable global success story, apart, I would add, from football, where it has usually been second best to the northwest. But the rest of the country has not done equally well, and in fact much of it has done quite badly, and in many places it just feels like it's getting worse. For left behind people and places, this model has never really worked. If you look at the local authorities with some of the worst educational outcomes in the year 2000 and compare them to now, they are almost identical, with the exception of London. London was amongst the worst, almost at the bottom. It's now the best. And when you look at those places outside of London, it's not just education, it's employment, it's health, it's crime, it's family circumstances, and it's the absence of any serious private sector economic growth. All of the key institutions which shape opportunity are in distress. But now we're also seeing increasing pressure in London too. Young graduates following the Leave to Achieve model are working hard, but paying large amounts in rent, and can only afford to buy if they inherit or borrow from the bank of mum and dad. Plus, entry-level jobs are getting harder to get, and AI is looming. Taxes are high, and young people are fed up, whichever route they're following. So for the past few years, the Social Mobility Commission has gone well beyond its previous approach to research by collecting the evidence relating to the geography of social mobility in the UK. We've compared social mobility in different places, produced a report on regional insights, we've produced deep dives comparing different places and their social mobility outcomes. We've shown that the general public doesn't see social mobility as being just an individualistic thing. They see it as being about social connectedness, about family, and about place, not just about their individual well-being. And if you want to see more about that, it's in our report about social mobility perceptions. And we've looked at the challenges and opportunities for improving the situation through stronger growth. And I'm not sure if anyone in central government has been reading all of this, but I know that the mayors have. And I know that outside of London, people think our approach is common sense. It makes sense of the reality that they see in front of them. Now, we haven't adopted our focus because we don't care about the original mission of the Commission, which was very much focused on child poverty. It's because we see this as arising out of our odd economic model. And we have said that almost all of our big social mobility challenges are linked back to our uneven economy with its big regional disparities. We have said that solving our social mobility problems needs to go back to the roots of the problem and address those economic drivers of opportunity across the country. We are not denying that there's a problem at the top in terms of social mobility. Incumbent elites are certainly very sticky, but conventional social mobility approaches do not challenge those elites. They just want a different mix of people in them. What we want to see is elites who are competing, making the economy work, but in ways that extend the benefits much, much more broadly. And to do this, we need to focus not just on the sticky top, but what we call the sticky bottom. We have pointed out for some time that social mobility projects are relatively plentiful when it comes to opening the door to university, but that NEETs have been neglected. We said this before the current upsurge in interest, which has coincided with the numbers reaching and exceeding 1 million. We said it because NEET figures have been too high for over a decade. In fact, arguably, they're always too high, because that should be a situation that never applies to anybody. But during that last decade, no one has taken a blind bit of notice. This has now changed, or is changing, and we're very pleased that it has. We now have a substantial report analysing and diagnosing the issues, and Alan Milburn has done an absolutely tremendous job of getting the country to listen about this issue. A genuinely tremendous job. Whether or not the interim report gets the diagnosis completely right is a matter of debate, and you're invited to discuss that in the sessions and panels that we have today. There is certainly more to be said about the experience of being NEET. My own concern as someone who's worked in this field for so long that I can remember when NEETs weren't called NEETs, they were called Status Zero, which feels like an even ruder name, and the first NEETs reduction strategy happened in 1999. I'm not sure we are fully understanding just how far behind some young people actually are, even in the current report. That's not the whole of the group, because it's very different. There's great differences within it, but the really truly disadvantaged within that group. And the SMC is currently undertaking qualitative research into NEETs in Blackpool, where I work in my day job, and where my college is leading a local NEET reduction partnership, and that research will be published in the autumn. We're doing further work because we think this group needs a lot more attention. We're pleased to see the progress that is being made, but we need to keep them at the centre of discussion. And we need to work hard to find real, workable solutions. And we need to debate and argue until we find things that genuinely work. That is why I'm so pleased to be able to welcome our keynote speakers today. We have Angela Rayner and Helen Whately, who I'll formally introduce in a moment this morning, and Lord Blunkett this afternoon. I hope they're going to kick us off with some fierce debate and discussion about the options we have in addressing this problem. I'm pretty sure that they will, and at the Commission we think this is a good thing. The more we debate this group, the more they preoccupy our attention, the better the outcome. But before I hand over to them, I want to talk about three things very briefly that I think are very important to this debate. They relate to the state, both in terms of capacity and culture, and welfare and its pros and cons. And to illustrate these points, I'm going to draw on some personal experience. First, in working in Stockport, where Angela is from, and second, from my own family. So I'm sure many of you know about Angela's backstory, but you won't know much about the detail of where she grew up. But I do know a little bit. I was working in Stockport in 1999 when that first NEET analysis came out. It was launched by the Social Exclusion Unit. And one of my jobs was to set up a project on the Bridge Hall estate, which is a place that is very dear to Angela's heart because that's where she grew up and where she was actually living in 1999 as a young parent. So, Bridge Hall, if you don't know it, is a very interesting and unusual estate because it's very isolated physically and culturally. It's called Bridge Hall because there is one way in and one way out over a bridge. There isn't another way in. And once you're in, you have to know the estate and know your way around the estate because it's its own community, completely own community. But Bridge Hall had won some money from the government to set up what was in those days called a single regeneration budget program. It was the way in which area-based regeneration was done in those days. It later changed, was replaced by things like New Deal for Communities, which is a program I was about to go and work on in East Manchester. I'd worked in Stockport for about 9 months. I'm sorry to say this, Angela, I did find it a bit boring, because apart from Bridge Hall, there's 2 other very poor parts, Brinnington and Lancashire Hill, and the rest of it is a really sedate middle-class borough. Honestly, I'd probably say it might have been the most boring borough in Greater Manchester. Maybe Trafford gets that accolade, but then it was quite dull, apart from these estates. But what was interesting was the division between the areas. I actually think the worst place to be poor was probably Stockport, because the communities were so separate. Bridge Hall was completely separate, Brinnington was separate, Lancashire Hill was separate, and middle-class Stockport took very little notice, if anything. So, and that's at the heart of the SRB story. So what happened was, the night, I remember it very vividly because it was my last day working for Stockport Council. I was starting a new job the day after. And my job was to go to the first meeting of the SRB partnership, which the local council were leading. Their job was to bring together all the public agencies who were going to work together and make Bridge Hall Estate a better place. It hadn't been helped by the fact that on Bridge Hall Estate, they do occasionally have some community problems, and one of their problems, which I think still might be a problem today, was young men and motorbikes. And it was an ongoing issue which kept hitting the local paper. But the local councillor, who has had a history of changing parties quite a lot, had changed parties the week before and made a public statement around the young people on the estate, and he'd referred to them in the headline banner on the local paper as being scum. So you can imagine the context of this regeneration meeting wasn't great. So the council were determined to hold their first board meeting to how they were going to administer this money, and they were going to hold it in Bridge Hall Primary School, the local primary school. I think your school, Angela, so also the school, by the way, that Phil Foden went to before he signed for Manchester City. Heart of the community, always getting burgled, the one place you could hold a community meeting. But they were determined to turn up to this local community meeting and hold a formal meeting. So the room was set out with the tables like a committee meeting for the council. And what they hadn't realised was people on Bridge Hall took huge exception to the headline in the local paper. And they'd heard that the SRB meeting was happening, and they came to see. And whereupon the next 2 hours of painful interaction between the local community and the council took the form of the council insisting on carrying on their meeting and telling local people to be quiet. And the more local people were told to be quiet, the more bouncy the evening got. It calmed down a little bit when we talked about some of the projects and they realised what might be happening to improve the estate and so on. I had to leave as it got towards 9 o'clock. And as I left, the temperature was rising. And I tell you, absolutely, God's honest truth, the head of housing and the superintendent of police were stood on the steps of the primary school calling police reinforcements to escort the councillors home in case they got attacked by local residents. So, what does that tell you about state capacity? Well, there's a lot in there about our current situation around NEETs. We actually don't know much about NEETs because we don't have anybody that's responsible for them. So all the research that's being done, we're doing research, others have been asking us to access NEETs in Blackpool, we've had lots of journalists, lots of newspapers and so on. Well, it's quite difficult, because unless you're with the DWP, and that's only a small number of the total, nobody actually knows them. Nobody talks to them, nobody has any real contact with them. And that's very much, for me, illustrated by that story around Bridge Hall, because how are you going to build a good community if you don't talk to people, if you can't build good relationships, if you can't have the foundation on which to give people a better future? That's never going to happen. Now, time's running out, so I won't tell you all my other Stockport stories. It wasn't always as boring as I've made out. But I think there's a lesson in there about systems and how they work and how they need to align with dealing with the problems in front of them. And if you don't do that, you're going to make them worse. Now, it's interesting, the early findings of our work on NEETs in Blackpool is throwing up some quite interesting things that are in the Milburn Review even. So young people are talking about how they spend their day. Well, it's quite different. Some are spending quite a lot of time looking for jobs. Others are spending maybe an hour a day looking for work. The rest of the time, they're on their own. They're on games. They're isolated. They don't know many people. Life is quite dismal and quite isolating and not very good for mental health and not very good for just building good relationships. They talk as well about the support they currently get. They say they don't want generic support from the job centre. They want personalised individual support that can help them to find the best solutions. They don't know what they are. One of the findings of our research is that too many young people, remember that 28% of families in Blackpool are jobless and workless. Too many young people have no parents to tell them what the world of work is like because nobody in their family works. So it's not a reality to them. They don't understand all the stuff that other people know about work and jobs and so forth. And they talk about that quite a lot. And they talk about how disconnected their lives are. And these are things, therefore, that whatever the responses are, we've got to have services that can build those relationships and put that back together. Now, I was instinctively drawn, I think, to the Bridgehall estate because it was very similar to the estate that I lived in my teenage years in North Wales, an estate called Pyloes Estate. So I can still pronounce it with the proper Welsh words. Both very geographically separated from the surrounding area. Bridgehall was built in a pocket of land. I think there was a field next door, Angela, which then got private housing built on, which really caused a lot of local tension. But like I say, you could only get into it over the bridge or out over the same bridge, and very isolated from the surrounding area. I grew up in Colwyn Bay in North Wales, seaside town. Our council estate was built on an old farm on the edge of town. We didn't even have a shop when it was built. It was beautiful to look at. You could see the sea. You could see the rural areas. You couldn't get a bus. You had to walk 3 miles down the hill and 3 miles back up the hill to go to the shops. It was extremely isolated. It also had that strong sense of being a community, a bit under siege, a bit inward-looking perhaps. Also had the same problems around antisocial behaviour. We didn't have the boys on bikes, we had Hell's Angels, and the challenge for the local council was to accept the challenge to walk the streets at night, because the local said he wouldn't do it, he said he would. I don't think it ever actually happened. I have to say I never really saw the Hell's Angels either. I often think there's lots of myths around these things. Now, I don't particularly like to talk about my experience growing up in those areas. I know the Commission always asks me to talk about it, and I don't like talking about it for a number of reasons. One is, I do not subscribe to the view that lived experience trumps everything else. I think you can have a really good understanding of these issues through empathy, through understanding, through finding out about it. I don't think it gives you an exclusive insight. It can be helpful, but it's not the be-all and end-all. The other thing I don't like is, I don't like being asked to talk about it because I think for lots of middle-class people, it's a form of poverty porn, and that just annoys me. So I think it's not helpful. But I do want to talk about two aspects of it, which I think are important. My experience growing up on that estate in a family where nobody worked after I was 10 is I'm not a big fan of welfare. I am in certain circumstances, but I'm not a big fan of welfare as a lifestyle. And I want to explain why. So I saw my parents go onto welfare when I was about 10. The longer they were on it, the more you trapped in it, the less they had agency, the less they felt in control of their lives, the less choices they make. I remember when I went away to university sending money home for Christmas because nobody ever had any money for Christmas. So I used to send this money home for Christmas. And then I would be really disappointed when I got home to realise there was still no Christmas because they'd spent it, because they got so used to being dependent that that just is what happened. You can't get angry about it, it's just sad. But watching the impact on people over a long period of time, when you go back to those families in Blackpool and think of those 28%, they don't know any different. They don't know any different. How are they going to know any different? There's a culture that grows up around it, which we've got to take very seriously. But it was a culture that was much worse for my brother, who was older than me, because he was a young person growing up in that context. And he, sadly, had all the characteristics that we now describe as neat. Nobody knew about NEETs in those days, but we had a lot of them in the 1980s. Young people who left school with no qualifications and not much future. He got 1 GCSE, held down a set of probably fairly temporary jobs in retail, sometimes hospitality. But from a young age, the one thing that stood out for him is he had never been to school very much, was a prolific non-attender, didn't do very well in terms of achievement, and he started drinking very, very young. So his friend gave him some home brew when he was 16, and I swear blind, that was the day he was addicted, because he didn't stop drinking much after that point. There was nothing much anybody could do to change that. Alcoholism and drug addiction are very, very difficult things for people to deal with. There are no easy answers. I've never met anybody that's got a magic solution that could say you can turn people's lives around in those circumstances. But what I can say is that the welfare system actually made his problems worse. What do I mean? Well, phenomenally, and I'm horrified to this day that this happened, my brother, who would go on binges for days on end, was living mainly on welfare. In the 1990s, they put him on what would be now called disability living allowance. They called it a different name then. I can't remember exactly the name. I'll remember it at some point. Because he was an alcoholic. Because they decided he was such an alcoholic, he couldn't go to work, so they gave him the two things that were the worst outcome: more money and more time. So he just got worse. It ended up with his drinking getting so bad that he became a street drinker. He ended up dying in the street at 42 because you just can't turn that round. And the day the police found him, they couldn't find us for 2 days because the people that he shared a flat with were all drug addicts. My brother was an alcohol was his drug of choice. The rest of his flat people were drug addicts, and nobody knew who he was, even though it was his flat. So nobody knew who his family was. It just took that long to work it out. Now, I don't need to feel sorry for me because it's my brother you should feel sorry for, but I tell that story because when I look at what happens in where I now work in Blackpool, I can see all the same things happening. Of state agencies who lack the capacity to understand the people they're working with, and systems that produce the wrong kind of outcomes. So let me just tell you what I mean. In Blackpool, we have lots of people like my brother. If you walk around the centre of Blackpool, and we are doing things to change this, so it's not all doom and gloom, but you'll see lots of young men, well, men in their 30s, 40s, 50s, in the street drinking, and they've moved to Blackpool from all over the country. Average life expectancy for adult men in Blackpool is around 50. Just let that sink in a minute. That's not because living by the seaside is bad for you. It's because the tourism economy has changed. The houses that were once guest houses are increasingly turned into houses of multiple occupation. Those landlords don't live in Blackpool, but they know that buying those very cheap properties means that they are going to get a cheque every month forever. They know they don't even need to come back and visit. They don't need to repair. They don't need to look after them. Why? Because here's their strategy. They go to the prisons and they recruit people who've got no option about where to go, and they encourage them to come to Blackpool. If it's not the prisons, it'll be other ways of making Blackpool attractive. And literally, they tell me in Blackpool that landlords would meet people off the train who'd come straight out of prison, and they could go straight into accommodation in Blackpool, no references required, nothing. Why? Because of the welfare check. And then when they get there, I just want you to think about the impact that has for everybody else. Because it sounds like I'm being a bit horrible, criticising why they're coming. In Claremont, in the middle of Blackpool, it's a local community which is very run down, has a lot of those former guest houses. The police did had a weekend of activity around about 6 months ago, and they found a phenomenal amount of drugs, street dealing and other drugs, just by stopping cars, arresting people and so on. Of course we're going to have loads of drugs in those areas. Why? Because that's where the market is. Because we've just imported them all to live together in the same places. All together. All in a cluster, no services to support that very much, or services that are very stretched, into the same place. Another area I went round a while ago called Revo, I think we did a tour with the Independent Commission on Neighbourhoods, who are looking at now at the issue around neighbourhoods, and I think that's really important work. I think I met around about 18 people in that day, of different ages and backgrounds. Nobody had come to Blackpool for a job. Now, there are loads of people working in Blackpool. There's loads of people with very highly paid jobs, not always in the centre. But in those central areas, what we've ended up with is a system where we cluster very poor people with a lot of very high needs together. And then you think about the impacts on those places in terms of their downward spiral. It becomes, you've got a lot of people with drinking alcohol problems, so you've got landlords that don't care, you've got drug dealers who come into the area, you've got young people recruited in to deal for those young people because there's no other way of making a quick cash. The whole thing's going in a downward spiral. And that spiral is something that is happening in all kinds of communities across the country, and it's the flip side of that economy that I described that we've had for 30 or 40 years, and it's something that we don't understand properly. When we talk about disadvantage, opportunity and social mobility, That's the sticky bottom. And that's what's happening in those places. So, my point is, I think if we're going to deal with this problem, and hopefully we're going to debate this today, we need to be really frank about the solutions. There are no easy answers, but we need services that actually care about those people. So we tell people at college, we tell our tutors, the starting point of everything is you've got to love your students. If you don't love your students, don't work for us. You can be the best teacher in the world. You've got to care about the outcome. That's the foundation of everything. Then you've got to know about your industry and be a brilliant teacher. But agencies have to love those people as if they're their own, and they've got to work with them as if they're their own. And they've also got to work together and understand what's actually happening and not work at cross purposes, because actually that makes it worse. So that's my rant for the day to start it off. I know we need to move from diagnosis to solutions. So I've given a diagnosis, which I hope is helpful. I'm now going to hand over to our two keynote speakers, because I think they will start us talking about solutions. So to start with, I'm going to hand over to the Right Honourable Angela Rayner MP. Angela has long been a champion for the forgotten demographics of our workforce. Having served as Deputy Prime Minister and overseen the portfolios for housing and communities, she understands that social mobility isn't just about a classroom, it's about secure homes, fair wages and the dignity of work. Please put your hands together to welcome the Right Honourable Angela Rayner MP to the stage. Thank you.
Thanks, Ellen, for that introduction and for inviting me to speak today and for reintroducing me to my roots on Bridgall Estate. And my nan actually lived on Lancashire Hill and my family is still in Brinnington today as well, so I know all of those areas very well. And I suppose it says a lot and probably says a lot to your audience about why I'm the sort of person I am today and the things I've done in the 10 years that I've been in Parliament. I have no doubt that this is not going to be the most watched speech in politics this week. But friends, the Child Poverty Act was signed into law on the 25th of March in 2010. It was virtually the last act of the previous Labour government. And I didn't mean to get too political early on, but when people talk about Labour values, this is what they mean. Taking and tackling action on child poverty, a fair chance for every child, and a society where there is no ceiling on where your talents and hard work can take you. Now, when the Commission invited me to speak today, they said the organisation uses data to analyse the cause of social mobility in the country. And I thought, I know a thing or two about that, because I'm one of those data points. As Alan mentioned, I was actually a teenage mum in 1999, single parent on Bridgall Estate, and I was a NEET at that time as well. So I've lived it, and I know that intervention makes a real difference. So I hope I can be a bit optimistic in what I say about what the state did for me and what I see it does for people of my community today. It was the state that gave me and my siblings a better chance of at life. And as Alan said, my parents were unemployed throughout all of my childhood. We didn't know anyone in work apart from my nana, who held down 3 jobs to support us. So when I talk about the poverty we faced, I always think that we didn't ask to be born into the circumstances of our family unit. But what I will say is that all 3 of us, me and my siblings, are now contributing. And that was only possible because the state, our community, our area, and my parents brought us up. We all worked hard, but there was no way we could have done it alone. And now we're contributing more than we take. And that is the value of an economy that cares. It was every single taxpayer in the 80s and 90s who contributed to my life chances. It's a community that raises children. It's a common endeavour. And it was the idea, as a country, that we're bigger than the sum of our parts, that gave me and my siblings a hand up. So I pay sincere thanks to those that were around paying their taxes then. But it's unbearable that today so many children, the adults of tomorrow, are in poverty. When they're not given these opportunities, we as a country will be starved of that unrealised potential. And that brings me on to housing. So many people are now in poverty because of their housing circumstances. And even in my life story that I talked about on Bridgall Estate, the one thing that we always had when we was growing up was our council house. No matter what happened to us, no one could take our home away from us. And that meant that me and my siblings could go to the same school, Bridgall Primary School, that we were in. We had our friends around us, and we had our close-knit community. Yes, it was rough at times, but we had each other, and no one could take the roof from over our heads. Now, I'm sorry to say that that can't be said for a huge number of children now. For children in poverty in 2026, they're in temporary accommodation. They're passed from pillar to post, a risk of being displaced from their community through no fault of their own. That is why I'm so proud that as Secretary of State I had the privilege of ending Section 21 no-fault evictions. It had been promised many times before, but it was a Labour government and Labour values that delivered it. So families can't be made homeless by no-fault evictions anymore. And one of the drivers of poverty is struck off with one act. But it's also why I made it my mission to build the biggest wave of social and council housing for a generation. It's why I dug my heels in and I demanded £39 billion for social housing. And the Treasury won't thank me, and I was the last one to settle on my budget. But I'd do it all over again. The same is true for welfare. You hear arguments for taking away people's support. Families are told to pull themselves up from their bootstraps. It's no fun to be going to a food bank to feed your children when you're in work. It's no fun to have your wages topped up because you're not earning a real living wage. These are not lazy people on the dole. They're working families who can't keep up. That's why the Employment Rights Act was so important to me. My life experience tells me that people do want to go to work, and people who work should have the dignity of being able to provide for themselves and to provide for their family. And I make no apologies about that. If you're working full-time, you should be able to pay your energy bill, do the weekly shop, and maybe even afford a little holiday at the end of the year. Yet so many working people can't afford that. But my Employment Rights Act means that for 11 million workers, they won't have to live with an exploitative zero-hour contracts, not having the security of knowing what their income is going to be. They won't have to live with the insecurity and fear of fire and rehire, where they can lose their job just like that. And yes, they will have the right to statutory sick pay from day one in the job. That is an achievement of this government that they can own. Now, when it comes to NEETs, we are not dealing with a failure of the ambition for young people, of the young people. It's a system, I believe, that is letting them down, leaving them sidelined with poor health, disabilities, and loneliness. It's a system that fails to prepare people for work and employment support that locks young people out of work. It will take the same collective intervention that changed my life if we're going to help young people into employment, education and training. And the same is true for removing the 2-child benefit cap. And I'll set out my stall and I'll stand by it. This Labour government has raised over 400,000 young kids out of poverty. That's not something we should be shy about. It's not something that we should hide away from. We should have the courage to say that those are our values and we stand by them. And the same is true for local government funding. As Secretary of State, I reversed the cuts introduced by the previous government, who were there before, who said that we need to take money away from the most deprived councils and give it to the most affluent councils. But I said no. I said we deliver a new funding model based on need, that said no matter where people live, where there is deprivation, there should be support. And it's why I also devolve power to our regions. So I'm glad that the Commission has pushed for more place-based approaches to social mobility, with the help of giants of our labour movement like David Blunkett, who you'll hear from later today. The government is committed to including the Social Mobility Commission in the statutory code of practice for the Devolution Act. And I'll finish by saying that this organisation exists because Gordon Brown saw children growing up in poverty. He refused to cross the road and look the other way. Now, whatever your political affiliation, we in this room will not look away. The scale of the problem is now bigger than it was in 2010. Parents are living with the reality of low wages, high costs, and struggling to keep a roof over their heads. Now, whatever the method, we are all motivated by a desire to give people opportunity and tackle poverty. Now, I've often said that ideology never put food on my table when I was growing up, and we must be pragmatic about the best way to improve outcomes, and I welcome the opportunity to have that debate today. Social mobility isn't just about university access and elite jobs, and social mobility shouldn't mean that you have to change your class to improve your life. We might disagree on how we get there, but from my life experience, I can say that it was tax credits that helped me when I was that single mum in 1999 on that Bridge Hall estate. Intervention that gave us a council house, free adult education that allowed me to go back into school when I left with no pass rates on my GCSEs. The Sure Start Centre that helped me to change that link, that poverty link that had plagued my family for many generations. The NHS. That's the intervention that I relied on. That was the offer of the last generation. And I look forward to hearing your ideas on what we can offer the next. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. I know she has other engagements to go to, so thank you very much for making the time today. And with no more ado, I'm going to introduce our next guest. And it happens to be her birthday today, so a very happy birthday. So, as the Shadow Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, Helen is at the very heart of the debate regarding the future of our welfare state. With her extensive background in the Treasury and the Department of Health and Social Care, she brings a rigorous evidence-based approach to policy. Helen has been a vocal advocate for systemic reforms that balance compassion with economic sustainability, and her insights into how we can better incentivise engagement for young people currently detached from the labour market will be invaluable. Please welcome Helen Whately MP to the stage.
Good morning, everyone, and Alan, thank you very much for your introduction and for your birthday wishes. There are no secrets in politics, it turns out. But what better way to spend my birthday than here at this conference? It's also a pleasure to follow Angela. We both want to make our country better, though I'll be straight with you, I do disagree profoundly with Angela about how we do that. But I also truly respect her. She's come from teenage mum to Deputy Prime Minister, and who knows what next. But that is not a well-trodden path. I came here through a more conventional route. I went to university, I had a business career, although it wasn't always easy for me either. But when Angela was a teenager grappling with a baby, I was doing what many of you will have done in your teens. I was picking up holiday jobs to fund nights out with friends, and those were formative in their own way. I was waitressing in a pub when the chef often failed to turn up, so we had to do ready meals in the microwave. I was answering the phone in a marketing agency in a sing-song voice, which I did so badly, I was fired. And I was cleaning toilets on a boat. The less said about that, the better. But it was cash in my wallet, and I learnt a lot in the process. But there are now 1 million young people not in employment, education, or training. 1 million. Just think about that. Birmingham has a population of around 1 million. Imagine everyone in Birmingham, but all aged 16 to 24, and not doing anything. There are now over 700,000 young people unemployed, looking for work but unable to find it. Go back 25 years, and nearly 2/3 of young people were in work. Today, it's barely half. I could give you more stats, but actually I'd rather talk about some of the people behind these numbers. 2 weeks ago, I hosted 10 young people in Parliament to talk about their experiences looking for work. One of them was a young woman called Aaron. Aaron's done 5 years of physician associate training. She's also submitted hundreds of job applications for healthcare roles, but also for jobs in retail and hospitality. She's articulate, capable, and determined. At the moment, she works part-time in domiciliary care because, in her words, she said, "I don't want to go onto welfare." She's done everything right. She's studied, she's passed exams, she's qualified, motivated, and keen to work. And still, she cannot find a job that reflects what she has to offer. But she's only part of the picture. I also want to talk to you about Daniel. Daniel's mum is a constituent of mine, and he was 16 when the pandemic hit. He stopped going to school during lockdown, and he never really went back. He's on the autistic spectrum, not severely, but enough so that social situations can be more challenging than for many of us. He's on a bus route, but the bus does only come twice a day. He had a job for a bit, but he gave it up. Now he spends most of his time in his room. His mum, she doesn't know what to do. His dad doesn't feature in his life. Daniel is not a bad lad. He's a young man for whom the one thing that provided structure in a household that otherwise lacked it, going to school, fell away at a critical time. No qualifications, neurodiversity, poor transport links. There are a lot of things that make it hard for him to get out of the rut that he's stuck in. Daniel's challenge is very different from Aaron's. 18 months ago, when I spoke to people about youth unemployment and NEETs, the discussion was generally about people like Daniel. And we might call them the COVID generation. But now we're also talking about a second different problem. It's not just Daniel who's out of work, it's also people like Aaron, young people with qualifications, motivation, and work experience too. One thing Aaron said sticks in my mind. She said, "It's so hard to have hope." For both the Aarons and Daniels of our country, that is now the reality. So how did we get here? There are two sides of this story too. I will start with the demand side, the demand for these young people from employers to employ them. Because employment clearly depends on two things: someone willing to take a job and someone willing to offer one. And that second part of the equation hasn't received much attention in recent years, not least because across the country there have been plenty of vacancies. But over the last 2 decades, Britain has lost around 1.6 million lower and middle skilled jobs. Technology has automated checkouts, warehouses and back offices. Whole industries have shifted offshore. Our economy has changed. That means there are fewer opportunities to get your foot on the first rung of the ladder, especially for young people without qualifications. Meanwhile, there's been an increase of 6.3 million high-skilled jobs in the same period, but right now, the number of graduate jobs is shrinking. In 2025, there are 1/3 fewer graduate positions as advertised than in 2024. Then on the other side, I'll talk about the supply of young people to fill the jobs that there are. With the shift away from lower skilled jobs, we've encouraged more people to go to university. But we haven't trained enough people to do all manner of trades, and we've created a generation of graduates without enough graduate jobs to absorb them. Many with horrible levels of debt and degrees with questionable value. Now we have 700,000 graduates on out-of-work benefits. 14% of graduates are unemployed, while many more are experiencing the disappointment of doing jobs which fall far short of their qualifications. Employers tell me that education hasn't prepared young people for work, and nor have Saturday jobs, because those are few and far between. Throw in the challenges of geography, parts of the country with fewer jobs or poor public transport. And while for me, moving for work went absolutely without question, if you've got to care for somebody in your family, or you can't see a way to afford to move, or perhaps because you're hoping you'll get social housing in your area, whatever the reason, moving won't be on your agenda. Then there is mental health. I don't doubt the young people I speak to about their struggles with anxiety and with neurodiversity. But the number of young people claiming sickness benefits has more than doubled in the last 5 years, with the steepest rise occurring in claims for mental health and behavioural conditions, though not in serious mental illness categories. Though some of those young people are working, many are not. And though work is usually better for mental health, and the longer you're off work, the less likely you are to go back. All this has played out over the last couple of decades, but there is a shorter term story too. And that is one of deliberate choices made by the government since 2024. The rise in national insurance and the equalisation of the minimum wage has increased the cost of employing young people. And more employment regulation means businesses are more cautious about taking on someone without experience. Now, I know a moment ago, Angela said that she is really proud of the Employment Rights Act. But the problem is, it's doing terrible harm already. We've got higher employment costs, more red tape. That has consequences. Saturday jobs, weekend shifts, junior roles, going or gone. The first rung on the ladder, missing. Without the first rung, There is no ladder. This is not because of technology, it is because of decisions made in Downing Street. I speak to a lot of businesses in this job. I've lost count of how many have told me that they have stopped hiring young people. They can't afford it. They can't risk it. This didn't have to happen. The government tells you they care about young people, but their actions speak louder than words, and their actions are destroying the lives of this generation. Keir Starmer said on Monday his proudest moment was when he became Prime Minister. I wonder, does he now feel the equivalent sense of shame for what he's done, for the young people left high and dry? He talked about growth, but in practice, he's killed it. 300,000 jobs have disappeared on his watch. 100,000 more young people are unemployed. Thousands more are on benefits. This is his legacy. Let's hope Andy Burnham does better for their sake. Now, Andy should look at some other countries, because we stand out here in the UK, and not in a good way. Other countries are facing the same technological shift, the same global pressures, but they are doing significantly better than we are. If you take the Netherlands or Denmark, their youth unemployment is materially lower than in Britain, around 9% and 13% respectively, compared to over 16% here. They have made different choices. They have a well-established vocational track through secondary education. Their schools have work-study pathways and sustained partnerships with employers. More young people leave education with the skills that businesses want. And they have welfare systems with clear expectations built in. Sport is available, but it comes with obligations to move towards work. Or look at Japan, which I know is a very different culture and economy to ours, but facing the same wave of artificial intelligence and automation that is reshaping our economy. Japan made a deliberate decision to see artificial intelligence as an opportunity, not a threat, to invest in reskilling. Businesses there are maintaining levels of graduate recruitment, seeing AI as an opportunity to grow as well as increase productivity. They still have their problems, skills mismatches and so on, but their youth unemployment rate is under 4% and falling. What have we done instead? We've tried in the UK to establish respected vocational options, but let's be frank, we haven't nailed it. We in government established standards for apprenticeships to give them the same credibility and consistency to degrees, resulting in many now becoming highly competitive. I talk to young people competing to get apprenticeships. Their fallback option is to get a degree, to go to university. But the apprenticeships are really competitive. But then there haven't been enough of them. Some sectors haven't fitted the model, nor have many small businesses. So we now have some huge workforce gaps in sectors like manufacturing, 95,000 vacancies there right now. And we've seen the demise of the traditional tradesman plus a lad apprenticeship model, which for centuries has passed skills on from one generation to the next. At school, vocational T-levels are popular, but they're not widely available. And UTCs can be great, but they're few and far between. The fact is, vocational routes are not mainstream in our education system. The Department for Work and Pensions has run and commissioned many programs to address the skills gaps in our workforce. But still, when we in this country faced labour shortages after the pandemic, in social care, in hospitality, in logistics, we went for an instant fix solution, and that was migrant workers, hot on the heels of waves of immigration when we were in the European Union. So rather than doing the really hard work of getting British people to do those jobs and fill those vacancies, we allowed migrant workers to come to the UK and do them instead. And actually that was the wrong answer. Now, with business confidence in the doldrums and the AI revolution upon us, we are seeing a decline in graduate jobs. In the face of economic headwinds, many businesses are using AI to cut costs and preserve margins rather than seeing it as a springboard for growth. And the consequence of all of this is that we now have more people competing for fewer jobs. And we have a generation of young people who are paying the price. That price is enormous. Let's start with young people themselves. We know from the financial crash generation that the scars of early unemployment run deep and last long. Lower wages, slower careers, poorer health. Then there is a cost to the country. Billions in benefits, 3 billion in tax revenues forgone every year, 38 billion in lost economic output. This is not just a social priority, it's a fiscal one, and it is getting worse. Every month of delay is another cohort of young people drifting further from the labour market. There is no time to waste. So what is the government doing about it? They have various work programmes. Fine, so did we in government. They're doing more, they'll tell you. They are actually paying businesses to provide jobs. But the fact is you don't fix unemployment with government-funded jobs. Nor do you fix unemployment by taxing jobs. Even they know what they're doing isn't the answer. That's why they commissioned Alan Milburn and got 200 pages of diagnosis, but no answers. His report contains a wealth of evidence. I'm sure many of you in the room have read it. Alan, you referred to it. But if I'm honest, I don't think our biggest problem is a lack of reports or a lack of statistics or a lack of analysis. It's a lack of action equal to the scale of the problem. So I'll tell you briefly where I think the answers actually lie. The first and foremost, the most important thing is jobs. We need more jobs. Jobs that young people can actually get. That means making it cheaper and easier for businesses to hire. We must cut the tax burden and roll back employment red tape. What's the good of gold-plated rights for workers? You can't even get work. Government cannot create jobs, but it can get out of the way of businesses that do. We need to back businesses to invest and expand. We need to appreciate the nation's entrepreneurs, risk takers, and wealth creators, and inspire this generation of young people to become the next generation of brilliant business people. The next founder of DeepMind or Apple or Uber. We need to embrace technology, and in the age of artificial intelligence, there will be winners and losers, and we need to be winners. Then as businesses grow and start recruiting, we need British young people to fill the jobs, not migrant workers. So let's make sure our young people have the skills they need to do those jobs, the means to get to wherever they are, the resilience to get through the bad days, and the certainty that they'll be better off if they do. That means making sure that work always pays better than welfare. Which is why we must be prepared to reform welfare. No more being parked on UC Health and PIP for mental health. People should get help and get out there. We need to make sure our education system does equip young people with the skills needed in the modern world of work and the ability to cope in the uncertainty of the time we're living in. In fact, not just to cope, but to thrive. In a time of rapid technological change, this should be their moment. And we need to look at the part we're expecting the state to play. Sometimes government can help, but let's be realistic, it's often the wrong answer. The things I see working are when people and organisations outside government seize the initiative. Let's be honest about the limits of the state. Sometimes what it most needs to do is get out of the way, get off the backs of the organisations at the coalface, and stop pushing people into a dead end of dependency. And let's raise our expectations of what young people can do. Give them the chance to take control of their destinies. First and foremost, make sure the jobs are there for them. Because a job is more than a pay packet at the end of the month. It's a chance to become someone, to build something, to make something of your life. The difference between living off others and paying your own way. The chance to buy a home, provide a family, and dare I say it when we're talking about young people, a comfortable retirement. But without that first job, none of that is possible. We have a lost generation before they even get the chance to start. The job of being in opposition is not just to oppose. It's also to come up with an alternative to whatever the government is doing or not doing. That's why I'm working on our plan for young people and work. A plan for more jobs for young people. It's a plan to make sure young people have the skills to do those jobs. A plan to bridge the gap between the young person stuck at home and the daunting world of work. A plan to make sure that work pays better than welfare. A plan to back the next generation to get ahead, to shift the prospects of young men and women like Daniel, and give young men and women like Aaron the chance to make the most of the skills they have worked so hard to gain. For them and for the future of our country, it's a plan to give us hope. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen. We're now going to do 15 minutes of Q&A. For some reason, they've given me an iPad because they don't realise how bad my technical skills are, but apparently some questions will be coming from the audience in a few minutes, so I think you're all been invited to do that. But Helen, thank you for that. And I wondered if we could start off, just to warm up while we're waiting for the questions to come in, with a couple which I think are quite interesting. Our discussions with young people in Blackpool have shown that their aspirations are heavily limited by what they're seeing at home, particularly when you've got a situation where parents aren't working and so forth. And in some parts of the country, those numbers are high. So since youth policies usually focus on the individual, what can be done in those situations where it's a family issue?
Yes, absolutely. And I'm conscious, a lot of what I talked about then was about jobs and the importance of jobs, because I think without a good number of jobs around, it's not only is it hard for the highly qualified person to get in to work, but it's even harder for somebody who doesn't have qualifications and, for instance, who's coming from a background where nobody works, to your point. So I don't, for a moment, underestimate the extra challenges that somebody has from some circumstances. And to your point, the family around you is important. Your question brings to mind a visit. I was in Newcastle last year, speaking to a charity that helps get people into work who are struggling to get into work. And one of the young men they've been helping, they told me about, is they were delighted because multi-generational unemployment on welfare, and this young man, I think he was in his early 20s, but living at home with family, parents, siblings around him, and he'd got a job. And in order to get to work each day, he was setting his alarm, his phone or whatever, for 7:30 in the morning, and he was turning up. But he had a problem. His family were complaining that his alarm was waking them up each day, and they said either he had to move out or give up the job. I mean, the frustration that this charity, there was like, we were doing the right thing by this young guy. This young guy was trying to do the right thing, and he was kind of faced with this choice of either give up work or be homeless by his family. Instead of his family saying, great, you're out there, you're getting places, the family was dragging him down. And you hear that as well in talking about communities, and you talked about the Bridge Hall estate, when someone's in a community where the normal thing is not to work. If the normal thing is not to work, it can be really hard if you're the only person going out to work. Again, when I was in Leeds, charity there, and they were saying exactly this problem where they helped a young woman get a job, but she was having to get the bus, and she had a child, and it was all really complicated. And her friends were like, why don't you just do what we're doing and stick on the welfare? Why? And you're making us look bad by going out to work. Stop complaining about your difficult job. Come and be one of us. And so the difficulty of whether it's your family or the circumstances that you're in can mean that can drag you back rather than backing you to the right thing. So we have to understand that where somebody is coming from, and how can we help them, the family around them, give them the backing, the community around them to give them the backing to go and do something and change their lives. We have to see that.
Excellent. I'm waiting for more questions to come through. I don't know if everybody knows how to use the Slido. Have we got instructions that they've got? So, yes. Or we can use, you can put your hand up and use the microphone.
We do old school with hands up and microphone.
Yeah, so Neil, do you want to come and, hands up if you've got a question. We'll do old tech. Anybody? Over here.
Oh, there's 7 on there.
Okay.
Oh, well.
Great, thank you.
Hi, I did ask my question on Slido as well. It's lovely that you're here. I'm disappointed with the party political aspect of the questions, and I want to ask, what are you doing together to make change? Because this is way too important to be passed around as political football.
Should we take 2 questions at a time and then do that one? Should we do a second question? Thank you.
We often talk about creating more jobs for young people, but there's been a serious lack of investment in careers education. I'd like to hear your thoughts, Helen, on what your party is doing to invest in careers education for young people.
Okay. Thank you. To the first point about sort of the party side, and I guess it's not a kind of politics for its own sake. I mean, I was straight, and I said it basically off the cuff, is that I do really disagree with some of what Angela said and what Labour see as the answers. I think we have a lot of shared ambition. What parties are trying to achieve is often the same thing. Like, I'm sure Angela wants people's lives to be better. I want people's lives to be better. People with really tough lives, you want them to be better. But we do disagree profoundly about, in some ways, how you go about it. Like, I genuinely think taxing jobs is really harmful. There are now fewer of them. I genuinely think there are things in the Employment Rights Act where it's true that are making it harder for young people to get jobs. This is really, really bad. So I think it's bad policy, and it's bad policy. I'm going to argue against it. I think we need better policy that gives people more opportunities, that gives people a chance to make something of their lives. So I will disagree with when another party, in this case Labour, gets it wrong. But of course there are things that you can do together, or that if there is a consensus around, stands the test of time. So for instance, the universal credit reforms Duncan Smith brought in, this government isn't unpicking those. There's been a consensus that it is better to have a simpler welfare system, which in large part means that work pays. It's gone wrong because of what's happened with the sickness benefit system. But the universal credit bit, the more you work, the more you have to take home. And there is a consensus around that. So that's not being unpicked. Also, for some of the DWP funded employment support programs, there's a lot of continuity in that. And any government will look at what other governments have done and go, well, the outcomes of that were good and the outcomes of that were less good, so build on that. And I think you do see, you see kind of things being renamed, but actually there is significant continuity, especially when they work. And I do think that's really important. So from my point of view, if something that previous government has done that works, well, absolutely, let's build on it. I mean, in fact, another example, so when I was a health minister, together with ministers in the Department for Work and Pensions, we developed and piloted a program called Work Well, which is about giving people health support and sort of occupational health support to stay in employment if they've got a sickness, which means that they're likely to drop out. The government is now rolling that out. And I've said in Parliament, I completely welcome that they've seen something that was working and they're rolling it out. So when something works, when we agree, absolutely, of course, it's not a political thing and parties should back each other when they do the right thing. But I guess I will make no apologies for when I really disagree that another party is doing something wrong. I will make the argument. As I say, I think that's fundamentally the right thing to do. On careers education, so there have been lots of attempts to do this better over the years. And we have the Careers and Enterprise Company trying to do that. Again, actually, this is continuity under our government and then continuing under this government. I still find that whenever I talk to school kids, it feels like there's something that's not working about the connections between our education system and work. As I said, I think we need to have a clearer vocational route. Countries that have lower youth unemployment, one of the things they do seem to be much clearer about, well, there is a real vocational path through, and that is much more closely connected to employment. The other thing that I see is, some schools actually do a really brilliant job of working with employers. There's a huge range here. I went to see a few months ago the David Nipa Academy in Derbyshire, and that school's absolutely brilliant, and they have a very, very close relationship with local businesses. And that involves getting lots of businesses into the school, and it's gone from a school that had very low academic outcomes and also a high level of young people leaving there and not going into work. They now have absolutely zero NEETs amongst their school leavers, zero. They all go on either to some form of further education or into work. And partly because by having close relationships with employers, by getting employers in, getting kids to experience something of work, by doing lots of things that connect kids with the workplace, they give these kids a reason to keep coming to school, a reason to study. They can see the point of sticking at education. So I think that's a really important part of connecting employment to education. The one thing where they still, clearly many schools struggle, but even them, is if you have children who are serially absent, then it's really hard to connect them with employment, clearly. So fixing school absence is something that we have to do.
We'll open up in a second, but just to go back to the point about careers education. So based on the experience of the school you just described, would you say that approach is more important than improving careers advice, or where does careers education fit in the story?
I don't want to be sort of drawn into either or, but I think what I've seen, and say I'm still working on what the answers are to this problem. To me, it's a crucial thing to use the time in opposition to really get into this and understand, is that giving children exposure to education, to employment, exposure to opportunities, that is really, really important. Whether it's advice, that's another question. I guess I'd say the jury's out more on the advice side of it, but definitely exposure to work.
In colleges, I think there's one or two college leaders here as well. I think we would say the quality of work experience is transformational for young people when that's good. And that's something that really absolutely stands out. But let's broaden the questions out. So, Neil, have we got some at the back? Thank you.
Yes, I'd like to ask about something which seems very specific, but which I think may be fundamental, namely the Saturday job. And numbers of Saturday jobs have been declining very steadily for a long time now. And they must be declining for a variety of reasons. And it seems to me that if we can't sort that out and work out exactly what is happening, then we're not really going to get a handle on what is happening with the youth labour market generally. And I wondered whether you had any clear thoughts on that, whether anybody was doing any direct work on it, and whether anybody had any really much deeper than what we got from Melbourne, any real understanding of why, for example, it's much easier for kids to get Saturday jobs in the Netherlands.
Thank you. So have we got a second question over there? Should we deal with Alison's question then?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's such an important point you make, that the Saturday job, as you say, and broadly holiday jobs and that have been in decline for some time. And I don't think anyone fully understands it. Clearly, there's an element of regulation, red tape. I talk to businesses and they say there's so many forms to fill in now that it's not worth it. It's really, it's very hard to employ somebody under 16. You really worry about all sorts of things. I mean, I know it from giving work experience, and when we have somebody under 16, that's an extra level of it's going to be difficult. So I know businesses that used to give 14 to 15-year-olds a chance to do something. Now, then they used to give 16-year-olds, and now they won't give anyone an opportunity till they're 18. So the regulation and the worries around that and employing children is a problem. There's a cost element where if you're going to pay somebody what used to be would be £5 an hour, £8 an hour, but now if you've got to pay them £10, £12 an hour, is it worth it because you're going to have to give them lots more support? There's the other side of it where I know I speak to young people at university who tell me that their universities tell them they shouldn't do work in their holidays around their studies because it's going to make them less likely to get good exam results. I genuinely have heard this from students that their university told them they shouldn't try and do work. I'm like, oh, this is what I did through university. I mean, it was like, how else was I going to pay for stuff? So, So I know that some, and it's a different picture around different universities. So there is a range of reasons why it's better in the Netherlands. I'll go and find out. I think, but I mean, one of the things we have to do is absolutely learn from other countries wherever we can, and you know, if we don't need to reinvent the wheel, fantastic. It's a quicker way of solving the problem.
Absolutely. We're going to do one last question, and I know everybody's been here a long time, so we'll have a break then before we reconvene. So, one last question.
Thanks very much. Talked about the quality of work experience is possibly been transformation at Derbyshire School, but the two examples you started with were two examples of people that had work experience and were not finding it was a long-term solution. So the challenge would be, I think, that the solutions you're proposing, which are employment-based, won't meet everybody's needs, and it needs a balanced approach. We're actually looking at some of those cultural changes and supporting communities, as well as looking at what has to be done in employment, or else it will be doomed to fail a particular group of needs.
100%, and that was why I was kind of trying to use those stories to illustrate what I see very much as two problems. There's a long-running problem of NEETs, and you talked about it in your introduction, Alan, of young people, you know, stuck in some way. And literally, when I became Shadow Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, when we talked about youth unemployment, that was what the conversation was about, was those people who hadn't got qualifications, who were really struggling with all sorts. And it was, how can we help those people get into the jobs that are there if only they could get there, including, for instance, transport, if only they had some way of getting to that job because they're off a bus route. But now we have another problem coming on top of this, and that is a problem of really well-educated, qualified people, yes, young people with degrees that you might count as low-value degrees, but also people with really good degrees from top universities, absolutely stuck, doing hundreds of applications and not being able to get work, or if they are, they're working in the retail jobs, they're working in the hospitality jobs, and to some extent, therefore, displacing those jobs that otherwise would have been something that you might be able to get while you were a student, or you might be able to get if you didn't have qualifications. So graduates kind of having to step down from the displacement effect there. So we have these like two problems, and we need to fix both. So we need to actually have those brilliantly well-qualified graduates going into great jobs, because they're the ones who are power ahead with our economy. They're the ones that will, as I said, be our future, you know, the next founder of DeepMind or whatever it would be. We really need those young people to be going places, and we also need to be helping those who are without qualifications and more stuck, and who do, in fact, need some form of more support. And we should think very hard about what that support is, and we need to think about the things that are stopping those people from taking up opportunities when they are, and that's an element of why you need welfare reform, because sometimes if you know that, frankly, if you can be better off if you're on your Universal Credit Plus, you can get PIP plus this, well then are you going to take that chance? And people criticize me for saying this, but I have conversations with people when I know they have turned down opportunities because they had an alternative of you know, getting by. So we have to tackle that, and we have to tackle all the worries about going up to work or knowing how to do work, or as you say, the work experience, a connection to the workforce. That is a more complex problem. To solve both of these things, we first and foremost, there do need to be the jobs and the opportunities out there. Yeah.
Helen, thank you. Thank you very much for both the speech and the Q&A. The most important thing for us about today is that everybody's talking about NEETs. And to go back to the question about the politics, so politics is about the solutions. What we want to do as a commission is have everybody talking about NEETs, because that is the most sticky social mobility problem. I hope we haven't unpacked all the questions today. There's lots more on the Slido, but you've got panels now where I think you can unpack those. We're not expecting everybody to agree on everything. That would be unrealistic and actually not very desirable, because the only way we're actually going to make any progress is having those arguments about different points of view, and that's what makes everybody sharper and better. So Helen, thank you. What I'm going to suggest now is we're about 20 minutes behind, so if we can shift the next meeting to start in 25 minutes, because you do need a break, refreshments, etc., and we'll catch the time up later in the day. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.